So good afternoon, everyone, and good morning in France. Welcome to this new session of the GEM Vietnam 2022 webinar series. And today we will be talking about structural change in the face of both climate impacts and net zero objectives of Vietnam. So this is an ongoing work that we have been producing for the final reports of the project. And of course, we welcome intense discussions on what we will present you. So we are pleased to have with us today Dr. Guilherme Magacho, colleague of mine at IFD. And he will start with a presentation on the exposure of Vietnam to net zero. Then I will present the exposure on the climate impact side and some aspects of also opportunities for Vietnam in terms of low carbon transition on the industrial side. So this basic presentation will last for 30 minutes and we'll have a discussion from Mrs. Hoai from CM, who accepted to give us comments and critiques, I hope, as well on this ongoing work. And of course, we would like to open the discussion to all the audience. So don't hesitate to ask questions, give comments in the chat first during the presentation, and then we will do our best to answer these questions. So without further introduction, I will give the floor to Guilherme for a start, and I will share the slides.
I will share the screen, or it's up to you.
Wait a second. Let me share it here. Can you all see the slides?
Yeah.
Yep.
Full screen? Good.
Yeah, full screen.
Yeah.
Guilherme, the floor is yours.
Okay, so basically, thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's a work in progress, but still, like, we have some results for discussing. So I'll present more the methodological stuff, like how we build this method and the application for the case of Vietnam. Well, can you go to the next one, please? Basically, first thing is present a little bit what is this STEAM approach, is like a method that we're developing here at the FT to understand the risks and the vulnerability of country to the low carbon transition, thinking about like different scenarios. And then if this low carbon transition doesn't work so well, doesn't take place, what's the consequence for the, if you have like a climate change with severe impacts on the economies, trying to understand a little bit how the economies will face differently these impacts. And then we go and Etienne will present for you these ideas on the opportunities that we have. Well, the STEAM model, I can go to the next one. It's based on the idea that low carbon transition is a structural change, a rapid structural change that is going to take in all around the world. Low carbon transition is not about like, not necessarily about reducing growth rates or for all countries, but it's changing structurally the composition of the economies. So there will be industries that will say these high emission industries that we call here sunset industries, they will decline, and low emission industries or industries that allows other industries to reduce emissions will increase. This process will be like, there are many factors that will impact then this process, like policies, technological change, and countries will be impacted according to their structure of production, trade, and finance. Basically, what we're saying here is that There are some countries that will be more impacted according to if they depend more on sunset industries in all spheres of the economy. And we, especially because we're talking about developing countries, we are talking about three main aspects, like these, what we call here, like the three dimensions that we're looking for. First, because countries will need to import a lot of input machineries to promote the transition, they need to raise foreign currency. Because for importing, you have to export. Basically, that's the idea. Or you have to receive a lot of foreign direct investment. That would be not enough. So basically, the idea is like, okay, if you depend a lot on these industries to export, if these industries are very important in your exports, these sunset industries, these industries that are that probably will disappear in the next decades, the transition are very risky. Why? Because you need money to need currency for importing, but you're not producing anymore because you're depending on industries that are disappearing. The same logic is valid for fiscal imbalances. Like you need a lot of public investment, but if you depend a lot on these industries in terms of fiscal revenue, there will be fiscal imbalances that can constrain the transition itself. And the same story again, but of course, like very differently from the perspective of the impacts that you have in the economy, is about employment, socioeconomic employment and wages, like good, well-paid jobs. So even though like most of the estimates and discussions shows that the impact is positive for employment, because the technologies are more labor intensive, they employ more people. Well, the results will be not homogeneous across countries. There will be countries that will win, and there are countries that will lose. And then we have to look at these countries and say, what are the situation for the country specifically, the case of Vietnam specifically? Well, the method that we use is this environmental input-output table. Basically, what is an input-output table? We have all the relations between industries. We have selling industries and buying industries. Of course, they are the same. For example, cars, they are buying engines, but they are selling for households. If you look at the, I don't know, engines, they are selling products for cars, but they are buying metals. Metals, they are selling metals for engines, production of engines and cars, but they are buying iron ores. So it's like we have all these relations, and then we have what you call the Leontief system, which is we are looking we're looking at a system that's considering not only the direct inputs but also the indirect inputs. So for producing a car, I need engines, but for producing engines, I need metals. For producing metals, I need ores. And then for producing a car, I need ores, I need metals, I need engines, I need everything. So that's the thing, like when you're looking at the system, the structure system, the connection between industries, we're looking for all this whole thing, that's all the supply chain. Well, now it's, what is environmental input-output table? We're not only looking at the monetary relations, we're not looking at only what you're buying, but also what you're consuming in terms of land, water, energy, minerals, all the natural resources, not only these ones, but mainly these ones, but also, next one, we are looking at what you're producing in terms of emissions, in terms of wastes, in terms of pollutants, water that is like you're using clean water, and of course, depending on the industries, and because you can look at all these inter-sector relations, we can look not only of the land used by the industry itself, but the land used indirectly by the industry. For example, producing textiles. Textiles is not very land intensive, but they use cotton, which is very land intensive. So textiles in the end is very land intensive. And we use these matrices to look at this, look at all these relations. And the next one. So we calculate these based on this system of matrices, the backward and forward linkages. in terms of emissions, in terms of all the variables that you are seeing here, but many others. Like these are examples, the most classical ones that we use. And then we found that there are some industries that are critical. They are critical. Why? Because they are very emitting forward, let's say, like the production of these industries use a lot of other products that are emits a lot, and these industries are used to by industries that are emitting a lot. So, for example, petroleum production is not very emitting itself. Like the extraction is not very emitting, but they are mainly used by other industries that are emitting a lot. So petroleum is a sunset industries. Iron and steel or aluminum is another story. They are very emitting, not because of the use of iron. Construction is not very emitting itself, or producing cars is not very emitting itself. But for producing iron, I have to emit a lot. For producing aluminum, I use electricity. For producing electricity, if the country doesn't have a system, electricity system that is clean, it's very emitting. So we're looking at all these things and then say, okay, what are the industries? Where are these industries, the sunset industries globally? They are in mining, especially fossil fuels, ores. They are in the petroleum sector, the chemicals, and for example, fertilizers. And non-metallic minerals, we have cement, plaster, lime. We have a lot of industries that are very emitting. Metal products that like iron, steel again, but aluminum, and of course electricity depends on the electricity mix. And next one, please. And this is for this is CO2 emission intensity, which is emission per dollar produced. So it's total emissions divided by the dollars that use directly and indirectly. And you have a comparison here of the world and Vietnam. What do we have is like the world, we have these industries like electricity, metal products, they are very emitting. And in Vietnam, there are some industries, specific industries that are more emitting than others, but the main message here is like there are like a lot of space to reduce emissions within sectors in Vietnam. Why? Because the sectors in Vietnam are very emitting compared to the world median. This is not world average, it's a world median. It's not like OECD countries. No, this is like all the 189 countries that we have in the database consolidated in the world median. And Vietnam is much more emitting than the rest. And next one. When you look at the total emissions and considering here scope 1, 2, and 3, scope 2 is embodied in energy, scope 3 is other inputs. For example, if I use aluminum and aluminum is very emitting, then there will be, this is going to be like the scope 3. Well, what are the industries that emit the most in total, in volume in Vietnam? Looking at the direct emissions, we look at electricity, and of course, electricity is the most emitting industry. But when you're incorporating other emissions, construction becomes a very emitting industry. Why? Because they use non-ferrous metals, which is aluminum, basically. They use cement, which is very emitting. They use other products that are very emitting. So the story here is like, okay, the industries that are very emitting for Vietnam are the same in the rest of the world, and these industries will be the focus of the low carbon transition in the next years. The next one, please. Well, and what is the dependence of Vietnam on these sunset industries? If you look at here, these dashed lines, they are the top 20%. So it seems that Vietnam is not very, very exposed compared, for example, to Angola, these countries that are very high in the vertical axis is the net foreign currency. So it's basically the external exposure, and the horizontal axis, the axis is tax revenues. So it's the fiscal exposure. What you can see here is that Vietnam is very close to the line, to the dashed line, in terms of net foreign currency, which means that they depend, not a lot, but relatively high dependence on sunset industries in terms of of the external dependence for raising foreign currency. In terms of tax revenues, not that high, of course, like it's not that dependent, but it's a country that is like in a relatively non very well situation in terms of fiscal external exposure, but is not as exposure as Kazakhstan, Ukraine, all these countries that you're seeing. The good thing, and this is something that Etienne will explain to you afterwards, which is something that we're looking at, is that because the country has a very high, it's very well positioned in terms of the complexity, even though they depend a lot on these industries to raise foreign currency, to raise foreign tax revenues, they have more opportunities than the average to move to green industries, which is this is why they have this blue color and not the red color. The red color are those countries that are very exposed, and at the same point, they cannot move to other industries because they don't have the capabilities. And Vietnam is relatively high exposed, but have some opportunities. The next one, please. Well, this is the composition of the external exposure. Of course, like the main issue for the countries in terms of foreign currency is mining exports. They are exporting, if you look at these the light blue bars, they are predominantly the main constraint for the external exposure. But if you look at taxes, it's not only the mining, not only chemicals, which includes petroleum, but also indirect impacts. Those indirect impacts that I was talking before. Like if even if you're not you're not taxing the sector itself, the sunset industries itself, you're taxing a lot industries that use these industries. So indirectly, you are taxing these industries. And this is something that accounts a lot for the exposure of the countries. The next one, please. In terms of socioeconomic exposure, what we have is like, in terms of employment, Vietnam is well positioned, but in terms of wages, it's among the most exposed countries. If you look at the right, the horizontal axis is the share of wages that are in these sunset industries. The vertical axis is the share of employment. What we can see from this is basically that Vietnam is a country where well-paid jobs are, sorry, these industries, sunset industries, they employed a lot of people paying good wages. That's the story. And this is very problematic. This is very problematic. Why? Because once these industries start declining, and this is something that may happen in the next 10, 15 years, there will be a lot of jobs that will be destroyed. And if you look at the color of Vietnam here, is a purple thing. In the SPC is the social protection covered. Is a country that a lot of jobs will be destroyed by good jobs, well-paid jobs, will be destroyed by the low carbon transition, and the social protection coverage is very low. It's not very low because it's not the red one, but it's not. It's relatively to the other countries is among the most. The population is among the less protected ones. Compared, for example, to Kazakhstan, Russia, which are countries that are very exposed, but they have some social protection. And of course, like with all the European countries, that they have much more social protection systems. And then even if you have like some employments that will be destroyed, they have some guarantees. So the social protection coverage is important to guarantee that the socioeconomic exposure will not become a socioeconomic vulnerability, let's say. Which means that basically, in the case of Vietnam, we have a high socioeconomic exposure, and it can reflect on some vulnerabilities because these jobs that will be destroyed, they are not very protected, well protected. The next one, please. These are the industries that are contributing. If you look at the agriculture sector, is the one that is more responsible, the most important industry in terms of employment and wages. And because agriculture sector, and this is something that we're going to talk about afterwards, but because agriculture sector is not considered as a sunset industry itself, of course, it will be a damage, an industry that will suffer from another side of the story, but it's not a sunset industry, it's not a very emitting industry. If we're considering methane, it increased a lot the CO2 emissions of agriculture, but still we cannot consider as a sunset industry because agriculture products will be demanded for, even if they are very emitting, they will be demanded for a long period. But mining, chemicals, and electricity are the most important ones in terms of wages. The mining industry pays directly, indirectly, of course, they pays about 6 to 7% of wages, while electricity is about 3%, and chemicals about 3% as well. The next one. This is a comparison of Vietnam with other countries. If you have like the Southeast Asia, the most exposure ones are Vietnam, Indonesia, and Myanmar. The first one, the third, and the one just behind, below Vietnam. But of course, like Malaysia is a little bit exposed, which means that they're dependent on Thailand as well, while Cambodia, Laos, and Philippines are, at least on this perspective, we see that not so many in the other, but they are in better condition. And then next one, we cluster the countries to understand a little bit what are the group that they are in terms of the dimensions that they are very exposed. And if you look here, we have Vietnam as a socioeconomic exposed country, which means that the case of Vietnam is a particular case where you have also India, China, Australia, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, some Western European, Eastern European countries, where the socioeconomic, the exposure is more led to these well-paid jobs that will be destroyed, and the country needs to worry about these, socioeconomic change that may emerge from the transition itself. That's it from our part, but Etienne, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Guilherme. So this what Guilherme just presented is really the exposure to net zero, and we see that Vietnam is quite heavily exposed, depending on the dimension. And the most important axis seems to be a socio-economic axis, so socio-economic consequences of net zero in terms of wages and employment. But the other aspect that we need to investigate for Vietnam is really also the exposure to a scenario where climate change will continue and we'll have heavy impacts. So what we attempted to do here is the same kind of exercise, but instead of looking at what Guilherme called the sunset industries, we looked at sectors that would be heavily impacted by climate impacts in a +2 degrees scenarios. So here again, the idea is the same, that climate impacts and climate damages and adaptation strategies are themselves a form of structural change. They need deliberate public policies, and countries are impacted differently according to their structure of production, the share of agriculture in their production, but the share of other sectors that are more or less resilient to potential climate impacts. And we will look again at the exposure according to the 3 same dimensions: external dimension, raising foreign currency. So how will Vietnam be impacted by climate change in terms of raising the capacity to raise foreign currency, in terms of fiscal imbalances, and in terms of employment and wages? Of course, it's a very narrow view of climate impacts, but you may have understood that we have had a much more exhaustive approach in general in the COP26 report and also in the rest of in the final reports that we are preparing. But this aspect of structural change and climate impacts is also very important and not very often looked at. So what we did is we built a global country sector climate damage database. That means that for each country, for a few key sectors, we looked at the most recent literature, so papers published recently in the last few years in Nature, Science, and similar levels of publications that gave us a damage function for these different sectors. And mainly the sector we'll be looking at are agriculture, and within agriculture, more specifically, different types of crops. We'll be looking at fisheries, and we'll be looking at energy. So these are the three key sectors that we'll be looking at. And then there are more, let's say, transversal types of impacts that we are looking for. So we have labor productivity impacts that, of course, affect an economy across sectors differently depending on the type of labor, of type of work that is needed for the sector. And then we are currently adding two more types of impacts, similarly based on the very recent publications. Tourism. So of course, tourism viewed as a source, and so it's international tourism, and how this demand coming from tourism affects different sectors in the economy. And we know that tourism is very important in Vietnam, particularly. And the impacts of sea level rise, which are not included in the results that we will show you today, but will be in the final report. So again, of course, what we do not pretend that the damage functions that we're using cannot be criticized, but at least they have been openly published in top level publications, and so we just take them to feed this country time sector climate damage database that we can then use by coupling it with the multi-regional input-output model that Guilherme showed. So I will not detail exactly which publication we use. They're described here. On agriculture, it's a publication that is used by the latest IPCC report to have a systematic review of the damage functions on agriculture by country. It was published in 2020. We use also on fisheries a publication from 2016 that looked at the change in maximum revenue potential from fisheries depending on different climate change scenarios. On the energy side, we used a meta-analysis published in Nature from 2020 that looked at all the type of impacts on the energy mix, depending on different regions where this energy mix is located. So we have region-specific, energy supply-specific types of damage functions. And on labor productivity, we used basically a publication from ILO from 2016 that calculates what is called a WBGT, which is a workability of labor, let's say, in the face of a combination between temperature and humidity. So that will heavily depend on the climate change scenario that you consider, but also on the degree of protection of work in the specific sector that you consider. So these are the sources used so far in this global damage database. But of course, we may introduce new ones as they are published and validated by scientific peers, and that will enrich the damage functions in this global database. So it's an ongoing process. So then we can start looking at first the exposure if we consider only the sectoral damage function, so on agriculture, fisheries, and energy. And here we see in the dimensions of external dimension of net foreign currency revenues and fiscal dimensions that Vietnam seems to be quite heavily exposed in comparison to other countries. So a little bit more than on the exposure on in terms of to the sunset industries. I mean, it's clearly belongs to the 20% of most exposed countries if you restrict yourself to these three sectoral damage functions. So you can disentangle this by looking at just the net foreign currency dimension and all the taxes dimension. And you can see that on the external dimension, Vietnam comes at the 17th position among all countries, and it is heavily exposed mainly because of the agricultural sector, while on the fiscal dimension, Vietnam comes at the 10th position, and it is this fiscal exposure is directly linked to agriculture, but also to the indirect impacts. So the whole value chain within Vietnam that will also impact the fiscal the capacity to raise fiscal revenues. Now, looking at the employment wages dimensions, you see again a heavy socioeconomic exposure of Vietnam in comparison with the other countries. So you see that most countries are located on the bottom left side of the screen. So that means that they have quite low employment wages exposure to damages, at least with the damage functions that we are using on the three sectors and in a world of +2 degrees. But then you have these few countries that emerge either on the employment dimension or on the wages dimension, and that seem to be quite heavily impacted. And here Vietnam is one of them and looks as much exposed in terms of employment as in terms of wages. While if you remember well, the exposure to a net zero was much more on the wages side than on the employment side. So here it's more equally distributed between employment exposure and wages exposure. So that means that it's not just the high wages that might be impacted. It's all, let's say, it's a more distributed profile of impacts in the wage scale. On the wages, you see that it's the third most exposed country, and with mainly again agriculture, but also the indirect impacts that emerge. And on the employment side, it's the 11th most exposed country, and similarly agriculture, indirect impacts, and a bit of fisheries that represents the main sources of impacts. Now, when you look at comparison, inter-country comparison in Southeast Asia, it seems that Vietnam comes a little bit first in combination with Indonesia and maybe Thailand, but mainly Vietnam and Indonesia are the two countries that appear the most exposed in most dimensions, especially fiscal dimension, employment, wages for Vietnam, and output for both. And then you have a second group with Thailand and Philippines, which appears as quite heavily exposed as well, but less than Vietnam and Indonesia. And then the rest, which seems less immediately exposed, at least in the three dimensions that we are investigating. So now this was just the exercise with the three sectoral impacts, but now we're doing also the same exercise with by adding the labor productivity impact. by looking at the labor productivity dimension. And what you see here is that, again, Vietnam is quite heavily exposed. In comparison with what you saw in the sectoral impacts results, more countries are quite exposed because of labor productivity. So you have quite a good group of countries that will be affected because labor productivity will be affected by climate impacts. But Vietnam is among the most exposed, either in terms of net foreign currency revenues or in terms of fiscal revenues. So without adaptation, important adaptation strategies in the labor market side, it will be quite a heavy loss. On this more socioeconomic side, you also find that Vietnam is exposed in terms of wages, with about 10% of the total that could be exposed because of labor productivity impacts. So 10% of the total wage bill of the country. And in terms of output as well, so this confirms what we found in the COP26 report, that losses in terms of output because of labor productivity impacts might be important as well. So of course, it's maybe the picture looks a bit depressing. That Vietnam is in a position to be quite heavily exposed to a net zero transition, but maybe even more so to climate impacts and a +2 degrees world. So actually, what kind of strategy should be used, and that's I guess the key question of debates in the current times in Vietnam, and we wanted to contribute a bit in the dimension of what is the potential for Vietnam in terms of green industrial and green technological opportunities. And here there's a much more positive and optimistic message that we will try to explain. So we use an approach in economics which is called economic complexity, where the idea is that, well, there will be a demand in Vietnam, but all around the world, for so-called green products that will allow countries to reduce their environmental impacts and basically to reduce emissions. The question is, who will produce these products, and can Vietnam absorb domestically a large part of this production? That's the key question. And countries that will be capable of producing these goods will have much fewer economic constraints during the transition period, because they will manage to produce good-paying jobs, to raise foreign currency, to get fiscal revenues, and so to increase then the speed of the transition. So this virtuous process of building green industries that will allow you to decarbonize even faster is the key issue that we want to try to start addressing, at least in this last section. Now, the production of green products requires specific capabilities, and these specific capabilities can be very highly technical, and that will create well-paying jobs, let's say, or they can be less sophisticated, and that creates different profiles of jobs for the country. So we'll analyze this specifically for Vietnam by using a database that was produced in 2020 by Milley and Tettelboim. And these authors calculate a complexity index of a list of products considered essential for the green transition, and they call it the Green Complexity Index. And then for each country around the world, they calculate a proximity of each country to these products. So based on the existing productive structure of the country, you can evaluate how far you are from the capability to produce these green products. Then you define what you call green competitive strengths, So that these are the products, the green products that the country is already able to produce in a competitive way, so with a comparative advantage. So not only the country is able to produce them, but it is also capable of exporting them in the international market. And you have also a range of green products for which the country that the countries cannot really produce now, but they have a high proximity in terms of technology of technology. So they master the technologies that would be necessary to produce these green products. And here it's not the green competitiveness, competitive strength. It's called the green opportunities. So the idea is that countries with high proximity have the capacity to produce goods, and then through appropriate industrial policies, they will be able to shift their production structure towards these industries. So what's the landscape for Vietnam and for neighboring countries, such as Southeast Asian economies plus China? That's the landscape that we have built. We look here at the Green Complexity Index through time, from the early 90s to the late 2010s. And Vietnam appears in gray here. So you see the very fast increase for Vietnam in this Green Complexity Index among the other countries. So what you see is that Vietnam ends the period with a rank 50 among all countries around the world, and almost among the top Southeast Asian economies in terms of Green Complexity Index. So it has the highest growth in this index among ASEAN economies plus China, and it is ranked 50 among all countries around the world. So this is the same kind of graph, but with the green complexity potential this time. So these are the technologies that Vietnam could produce or is close to produce in a competitive way. And here again, you see Vietnam in gray here, with a very fast increase at the beginning of the period, and then somehow slowing down a little bit, but keeping the more or less the same rank among the first in Southeast Asia, and the rank globally is around 40 something. Vietnam managed to maintain very high green complexity potential at global level and among Southeast Asian economies. But you see also that if at the beginning of the period you have clearly two groups of countries, there is a kind of convergence, at least for Myanmar and Cambodia, that seems to take place, and that needs to be confirmed in the next years as well. Now, what you can try to observe as well is looking at the product complexity index of these green products. So that's the PCI on the y-axis here, and the degree of proximity of the country. So how far is the country to producing these goods, these green goods? And so I took, I chose 4 different countries. So Vietnam is on the right-hand side here, Thailand, Korea, to have, let's say, industrialized, developed Asian economy, and in Indonesia. And so all points represent a type of product. The colors represent the environmental category of this product. And so if it is high on the y-axis, if it is up top on the y-axis, it means that the product is technologically complex. If it's low, it has a low technical complexity, so the type of jobs behind are different as well. And if it's on the right, it means that it has a high proximity, so for the country, so the country would be easily able to produce that type of good. If it has a low proximity, so if it's on the left, then it's more difficult for the country to produce the goods. So this gives you a landscape of the green industrial capacity of a country. What you observe is that you have Indonesia and Vietnam that have this roughly similar distribution of points, with a high proximity for low or medium level complexity green products that are still capable of producing high complexity green products, but with much lower proximity. If you look at Thailand is intermediary because it has the same level of proximity for low complexity products and for high complexity green products. And Korea has clearly the distribution of points in completely opposite to Indonesia and Vietnam, where you have a high proximity for technologically complex green products and quite a low proximity for technologically less complex green products. So this gives you a good, let's say, view of where the opportunities might be for Vietnam and where the efforts might be more difficult but necessary as well to develop more complex green products. Now, if you look at each one of those points that are on this graph, they represent different kinds of environmental or green goods. And I put just in green the environmental sectors where you have the most capabilities for Vietnam. So air pollution and control, cleaner, more resource efficient technologies and products, efficient consumption of energy technologies and carbon capture and storage. So you have these green lines represent the good strength, the strength of Vietnam in terms of green products, and the red ones are the ones where there is less opportunities, at least for now and according to this database. So energy efficiency, for example, and we have seen with Guilherme that actually the energy efficiency of products in Vietnam compared to the rest of the world was indeed quite low. But you have also natural risk management, natural resource protection. You have a few sectors that appear in red, while the others are more, let's say, neutral or intermediary. So this would need, of course, lots of more detailed analysis to see exactly what technology is behind these environmental opportunities. Now I will conclude with a few takeaways. Vietnam's productive structure is quite heavily exposed to a net zero trajectory. That means that the announcement of Vietnamese Prime Minister was very ambitious and will mean a systemic structural change for Vietnamese economy. But at the same time, Vietnam's productive structure is also severely exposed to climate impacts in all dimensions. That means that it is for Vietnam worth continuing this very active and lead by example climate diplomacy that will contribute to align global emissions with the Paris Agreement. And then the good news is that Vietnam's productive structure has very strong potential in terms of green products. And so that with some targeted industrial policies that I think Vietnam has also a very good capabilities to do, Vietnam could position itself really very comfortably in this green race that is emerging. And now, but the last point is really an introduction to what we will be talking about next week, is that these green industrial policies are also important for macro financial stability reasons. That means that if there is no green industrial policies, or if they are not well calibrated, then that could lead to a net zero strategy, or the exposure to climate impacts would lead to macro financial instabilities. So we have to really look at the dynamics of this ecological transition for Vietnam, and the type of policies that are put in place are very important for the actual macro financial feasibility of the transition. And I think we stop here, and I will stop sharing. Thank you very much for your attention. And I will maybe give the floor for a few words of Mrs. Hoai, if you are with us.
Thank you very much, Etienne and Guilherme. It's very interesting paper and a lot of work and rich information. I have several comments on the paper you have just presented. Firstly, I will mention on the two parts. The first part is more on the positive point, and the second is more on the comments, or maybe it's not a criticize, but it's a suggestion for the further improvement. Firstly, I can see that this paper is fit very well into the current policy discussion in Vietnam, given the context that Vietnam already announced the net zero emissions, and also the low carbon transition commitment. We also in the process of upgrading our industry towards the higher value added, and to rethinking about our industrialization and modernization, as you mentioned in our title. So I think the result is very useful for Vietnam, in particular, to point out some challenge of Vietnam in the low carbon transition, and also provides many suggestions for the direction in the future. So I highly appreciate the work, and it will very useful for our policy making in the next transition. And the second point is that I also think that in overall, the methodology applied in the paper is quite relevant, except the one for the exposure to the 2+ degrees. That I will comment later about that one. But for the other two, the one on the IO environmentals and the other ones on the complexity, I like these two frameworks, and is quite relevant. The third point is that I think one of the advantage of this paper is putting Vietnam into the context, in the comparison with other countries in the world. So it will clearly show where the position is Vietnam is now, the level of the low carbon development Vietnam is standing, and the need for the future direction. So I think the comparison with the international, with the other country is one of the very good point of this paper. And the fourth one is that there are so many, I think the finding is very interesting, and it's more or less, I think, reflect what other study also show. For example, it's about the level of emission intensity in Vietnam. I think is also I have a comment on this, but I think it's high. Vietnam is quite high at this stage. And also the finding on the less exposure to external and fiscal compared to the wage bill exposure, you call it you term is the social exposure. So I think it's quite relevant, and also it's so very many potential, as you already saw in the third part, that many green opportunity for Vietnam. So I agree, this quite a lot of potential for Vietnam to transform or to develop towards the low carbon development. So I think it's quite good, interesting finding, and also relevant. Secondly, I come to the second part on the my comments. Some points that you may interested in. The first one, as I mentioned, is about the measurements of emission intensity. You use the CO2 kilogram per dollars. So I think this one is quite kind of overestimate the emission intensity, because this kind of the CO2 per dollar is also capture the level of development in Vietnam. You know that Vietnam is now at the low level of value added. We are mainly on the assembly period, so the value added we create per output is quite low. Meanwhile, the input of electricity and also others is still have to use it. So I think if you compare not with the overall the world level, but also with the same level of development, I think it may have a more positive picture. But for sure, Vietnam still is very high emission intensity. I agree. And the second point is about the terms of sunset industry. I think it's the sunset industry here is not in the conventional term meaning of the sunset industry, like in the industrial policy. For example, in the power electricity, you call it sunset industry, but in fact it's only transfer from the fossil fuel to another type of electricity renewable industry. So in fact, it's not a declining of the electricity in the traditional sense, but it's just transform for the greener industry, greener electricity, greener power. And also the same for the chemical. The chemical and also the electricity is very important, or the key, we call it the basic industry for the whole country. It's also relate to the, we call it the economic resilience, or maybe it's the independent supply, something, or maybe energy security. So for me, I think the term of sunset should put in the quote and unquote one, and the meaning here is just to the transform is in terms of CO2 emission. That's it, for the greener industry. Otherwise, it will in the paper quite many what you said about the reduction of the or decline of that industry is not really true for the whole electricity or power industry, and it's not really true for the chemical industry. It will not actually decline as a sunset industry, but it will transform to the greener production of that industry. So I think the terms of the sunset industry should be explained or clearly carefully used in the paper. And the third point I would like to mention about the social. You call this you also find that the social economics exposure is quite high. But you also find that it's only in terms of the wage, not in terms of the employment. And for this social, you should something like a combine between the two aspects. And also, as far as I mentioned before, it is in terms of the wage, and also this the meaning of the sunset industry. For example, the power industry, they will not reduce in the future, but they will transform to the greener production. So the social exposure here, if there is, I think it's more on the labor mobility or the capacity to change, to transition in the greener job, rather than in the social protection aspect. Because on the one hand, is not relating to employment, job creation, because many other industry is more, job creation is more on the social dimension exposure. Then this one is on the wage, and on the wage the labor in this sector, they already have a high pay, high wage, so they have a good saving for the future compared to other sector in the economy. So if we compare them with other vulnerable people, labor in the agriculture and the low wage job, so they are less vulnerable. So that's why I think the finding on the social exposure, the high social economic exposure, should be more or less careful or explain better. And the fourth one is on the comparison. In here, you already compare with, in particular for the third part, the green one, you compare very clearly with the ASEAN country and the Asian one. So I would expect to have a similar comparison in the first part, in the IO and exposure to the low carbon transition, the comparison with others ASEAN country and the Asian, more developed Asian country. And also the compare in terms of the level of development, and it also compare in terms of the level of emission intensity. So the picture will be clearer if we have made that comparison. And one more point, the fifth point is on the methodology of the exposure to the second degree increase. Because I think you apply the impact, the negative impact of the climate change is in the future. The impact is in the future. but you apply it into the current structure of the economy. So I think it will overestimate the impact. I prefer the CZE model more, of course, in the country level for Vietnam. I think it will be more relevant because it will see the dynamic and the change of the economic structure in the future, together with the gradual increase of the temperature. So I think that for this section, you may reconsider the methodology, or maybe you apply for the future, but I'm not sure how to get that data for the all other country. But for this section, actually is in fact is more or less on the impact of climate change. So I will prefer the as our last paper is the use of the CZE model to measure that impact. And the last point is on the green, the third part, the green opportunity complexity. I think it's very interesting, and it will provide quite a lot of insight for us to design the future direction and also the policy. But I would like, if possible, to make it more comparison with the country with the same level of emission intensity. It will show more. I think if we make that comparison, it will help us to see more like a clearer the picture, the current and the future one, the development path for Vietnam. So so in general, I actually highly appreciate the work you have done, and I think that it will provide a lot of interesting and useful insight for the policy maker in Vietnam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Hoai. Thanks a lot for these very detailed comments and many propositions that are actually quite interesting, so that we can improve this this ongoing work. Maybe I will just answer on the let's say the second part, so the most fundamental question on the impact side. And then I will let Guilherme answer the questions on the exposure to net zero. So on the yeah, this exercise that we started, actually we're doing it for Vietnam here for the first time. This attempt to analyze the exposure to climate impacts. So I agree with your argument, of course. You can say that climate change is in the future, that the productive structure will change before we reach +2 degrees. And so that the exercise that we're doing is a little bit theoretical, right? It's like we take the current productive structure and we put it into a world of +2 degrees. But actually, we don't hide that. So what we're doing is exactly what you said. We take the current productive structure and we put it in a world of +2 degrees, which actually is not so far from now. We know that we're almost at 1.5 degrees now at the global level. And so +2 degrees might be before 2050. So so that's exactly what we are doing. And so what does it bring? What type of insights does it bring to do that? I think we have to be careful about the conclusion of what it says, but it still says something about the existing fragilities of the current productive structure of a country, also with respect to its external exposure to the climate impacts that might happen in other countries. That's also the interest of using multi-regional input-output tables. And of course, it's just a theoretical exposure. And your argument functions very well. There might be a structural change, but we know by doing this exercise where the structural change should happen if you want a more resilient economy compared to today's economy in a +2 degrees world. So I think it still says something in terms of the directions of which sectors should be more resilient to which kind of impacts. And so that's, I think, the interest of doing this. Now we also have the dynamic macroeconomic model that we'll present next week in the seminar. But I think the virtue of this is to have this very detailed sectoral approach, even if it's static, starting by saying Vietnam is exposed to net zero in this and this and this sector, but it is also exposed to climate impacts if the structure doesn't change to this and this and this sector and these dimensions. It's very useful to then, before going to dynamic trajectories, and you know that on macroeconomic modeling, you can always argue that the dynamics are not like this and that. They have strong hypotheses and so equilibrium on all the markets, or so you have to make strong assumptions always to in the macro modeling, and that's why it's still useful to use all the data as they are with as little additional assumptions as possible as a starting point, and then move to, of course, the dynamic modeling. That's what we intend to do. So that's my partial answer to your point on the impact side. Maybe Guilherme, if you want to have elements on the net zero side.
Well, thank you very much for all your comments. Like, they are very interesting. They go directly to the points that we are discussing now. So as Etienne said, is ongoing work, and so like these contributions are definitely very, very interesting. I'll go like details on them. First, in terms of the emission intensity, I completely agree that the emission per dollar is a biased measure of emission intensity, because like poor countries tend to have like lower prices, and when we're measuring like in terms of dollars, of course, like there will be a huge distortion in a trend to have to say to low income countries that they're emitting a lot, because the dollar is not a good measure for them in terms of the size of the economy. One way of correcting this is using purchasing power parity adjustments, which make a little bit better the results. Like, but the main issue here is that these industries that are emitting a lot, most of them are selling the international markets. So they are selling international prices, commodities usually, which is like the adjustment will also be biased. So of course that we can bias the results for one side or the other, but it's like it's kind of comparable, but I completely agree with you that we need to be careful with that. But the point I think it's more complicated here is that Vietnam is above the median in terms of income per capita. It's not a poor country. Vietnam, compared to the rest of the world, if you're taking like 189 countries, because these matrices we're talking about like almost every single country, 54 countries in Africa, I don't know, more than 30 countries in Latin America, So we are summing up them. We are considering all of them together. So it's difficult to say that Vietnam, the case of Vietnam, we are biasing for one side because Vietnam is like above the average. So if we're thinking about these, we should consider that if maybe we are distorting for the other side. Or I don't know. I'm just saying that for Vietnam is like Vietnam is above the median. So it's difficult to say that it's because of that that Vietnam has a very high intensity. No, it's not, because Vietnam is not a poor country. It's a medium to medium high income country. So according to World Bank, so it's of course, like compared to Europe, compared to Japan, to Australia, it's a low-income country. But compared to the rest of the world, to the 54 African countries, to the almost 30 Latin American countries, we cannot say that. But I think it's interesting to have some precaution on this data, because it's definitely not the best measure. It's not actually it's not a very good measure, but at least by having these, we have some ideas on these. About the sunset industries, the definition of sunset industries, you have a very good point, and actually it's something that I went very fast on this and I didn't explain. It's my fault. When we're talking about electricity, we're not talking about the whole electricity sector. We're talking about electricity from fossil fuels. We're not saying that the electricity sector will disappear. What will disappear, or at least we hope it will reduce its importance, will decline, is electricity from coal, is electricity from oil derivatives. So these are the industries that we're looking for. And these are the sunset industries. Electricity from hydroelectric power, maybe it's not. Electricity from photovoltaic, electricity from wind, definitely is not. So what we're doing, and you have like the IXO base, which is another matrix that we merge with this. We have 7 to 8 types of electricity. We have coal, oil derivatives, natural gas. I'm not going through all of them, but biofuels. So you have different kind of biomass section, different kinds of electricity. And we are only looking at these 3, which are the fossil fuel electricity. The same is for chemicals. We're not looking at all the chemical sector, for example, pharmaceutical. We cannot say that pharmaceutical, which is in the chemical sector, is a sunset industry. Definitely is not. Like actually, it's something that's probably is like will gain importance in the next decades. But some chemicals, for example, maybe nitrogen fertilizers, they will decline. They will be objective of a lot of policies. And this is something that we are working on. Within sectors and within these industries, we have huge difference across countries. For example, cement. Cement is a very emitting industry in most of the countries, but there are some countries that are now producing cement, and India, we have this technology. They are producing cement, not emitting, but absorbing CO2. So it contributes negatively to the CO2 emission. So it contributes positively for the transition. So, but the thing is, the countries that are producing now cement, almost all of them, they are producing with technologies, with power plants that are in few years will become very, very outdated, because there are new technologies emerging that are producing cement the same way that now we have the opportunity to produce electricity from renewable sources. In few years, maybe, I hope, we could, few decades, we will produce cement with much less emission intensity, or even contributing negatively to emission intensity. So emissions. So I completely agree with your point, and it's completely my fault, but because I didn't make it clear, but we're using the sectors with the industries within these sectors. We're not saying that mining will disappear. No, definitely not. Lithium probably is gaining momentum. Copper is probably gaining momentum because you need copper to promote a massive electrification of the systems of production. But iron ores, aluminum ores, of course, like fossil fuels, they are all in mining and quarrying, and these are the sectors that will be the most impacted ones. And then I completely agree with you in the sense that we should make it clear that these are not the sunset industries, but you have within them sunset products, and within sunset products you have sunset technologies. And this is something that we need to go beyond. We need to look at more specifically on these dimensions. Finally, your point on socioeconomic exposure, I completely agree with you in terms of it's not only about social protection, it's not only about, it's about making it possible to move towards green industries. And that's why we complement this analysis with the green technological potential, because what we're saying, okay, one thing is exposure. Exposure is, as Etienne was saying, is looking at your current situation and prospecting a scenario in the future, looking at your current structure. Now, if you don't do anything, this is what is gonna happen with your economy. But of course, like in 20 years, the economy will be very, very different from this. And what we're trying to show is that what are the industries that you should look at? What are the industries that you need to replace? You need to replace our fossil fuel industries. Where these industries are? In Vietnam, we have a lot of fossil fuel production. And then we have to look at the green opportunities to say, what are the circumstances, what are the capacity of the country to move the employments from these industries to the other industries, from these sunset industries to the green industries, to the sunrise industries. And then that's why we cannot just look at the static analysis. We have to look at the capacity of the country to move toward these industries. But I completely agree with you that it's not only saying that, okay, because basically what we're trying to do here is not to do a forecast of which country will be the most impacted by the low carbon transition. No, it's not about this. It's about which countries are currently more exposed to the low carbon transition, and what are the opportunities they have to move to other industries, and what are the macroeconomic problems that they may face if they don't move fast to the green and sunrise industries. So maybe making it clear is important to make sure that this is the chapter before the dynamic model, because like the dynamic model will say, okay, once you have this structure and once you have a dynamic change in the economy, what are the impacts on the economy? Here we're just looking at the exposure, and exposure is more on the current situation. If you not do anything, for example, we are not considering adaptation. The country has plenty of opportunities to adaptation. Adaptation will reduce a lot of these impacts. But because we're looking at the current situation where these adaptation measures did not take place yet, for sure that there will be like overestimation of the impacts, because we're under considering the capabilities of the country to move away from these industries. I don't know if it was.
Thank you, Guilherme. He's very convincing. Huh? This is why if you want to.
No, I agree. So we cannot do everything in just one piece. But you will make sure it's present more clearly the ideas, and also connect all the piece of work you have done to have finally to have a persuasive recommendation for the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much. I mean, we will really incorporate your comments and arguments. We talk about it maybe later with you. If there are any questions from the audience or in the chat, we have 4 minutes more for this. So don't hesitate to raise your hands or ask in the chats. If not, I mean, I will just present briefly the next week's seminar, which is the last one of the series. We had 13 sessions, so it was a very long series. So next week is the final one on the macroeconomic model. So what we were just talking about. So going dynamic and trying to assess the macro financial impacts of different scenarios of transitions and different scenarios of climate damages over Vietnam. So we've and Thi Thu Hoai, who will be presenting with me, has worked extensively on the model from the last COP26 report, and this will be also presented in detail in the final report of the project. So I encourage you to join us next week for this last session, and that's very complementary to what was discussed today. All right, so I guess we'll stop here. Thanks again a lot, Mrs. Hoai. Thank you, Guilherme, as well. Thank you, Linha, for the organization. And I will talk to you next week, next Wednesday, for the last session. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.